Good day all. This talk will examine the history of superheroes in North America. I shall focus primarily on the two big superhero publishers, DC and Marvel, but I shall also cover other publishers, including Canadian ones. I shall argue that, while they have created a wide variety of superheroes, their starting point was still the two basic superhero archetypes, the strong hero and the wise hero. Both of these have evolved into several subtypes, which I shall point out as we encounter them. The history of superhero comics in North America is commonly divided into several distinct periods or ages. While idiosyncratic periodization has been proposed by a number of different analysts, it is most commonly accepted that there have been four such ages. The Golden Age from 1938 to 56, the Silver Age from 1956 to 70, the Bronze Age from 1970 to 85, and the Modern Age or Dark Age from 1985 to the present. The Golden Age began with the first publication of Superman in 1938 and ended with the decline in superhero comics sales in the early 50s, which caused the majority of comics publishers to go out of business. The Silver Age began with the first publication of The Flash in 1956, continued with Stan Lee taking over the creative lead at Marvel with the debut of his Fantastic Four in 1961, and ended when the first generation of superhero writers and artists retired in the late 60s. The Bronze Age began with noted artist Jack Kirby's move from Marvel to DC in 1970, the liberalization of the Comics Code in 1971, the founding of new independent publishers, and the rise of a new generation of writers and artists. It ended with the decline in comic sales in the early 80s. The Modern Age began with DC's reboot via the Crisis on Infinite Earths storyline, which ran from 1985 to 86 and gave all of their heroes a makeover and update, thereby greatly improving sales. It's also called the Dark Age because it has introduced darker, more adult storylines, often focusing on antiheroes or violent superheroes. This reflects the transition of superhero comics from primarily catering to an audience of children to one of mostly adults. The Modern Age continues to this day. I shall now go through these four ages in more detail, focusing on the emergence of new superheroes in each age. The Golden Age began with the debuts of Superman in 1938 and Batman in 1939, both published by National Allied Publications, or NAP, which changed its name to DC in 1977. I have covered Superman and Batman in a separate talk, so I shall say no more about them here. The success of Superman and Batman prompted other publishers to start putting out original superhero comics. In 1940, Fawcett Publications put out Captain Marvel, who was basically a copy of Superman. Young Billy Batson became Captain Marvel when he said the magic word Shazam. Shazam is an anagram of Solomon, Hercules, Atlas, Zeus, Achilles, and Mercury. So, Captain Marvel is, quite explicitly, a modern version of ancient gods and superheroes. You might note that all of these superheroes are strong men, except the first, Solomon. The leader of the group, as always, is a wise man. For a few years, Captain Marvel was actually the best-selling superhero, But then DC sued Fawcett, saying that Captain Marvel was too close a copy of Superman, and forced Fawcett out of comics in 1953. Ironically, DC obtained the rights to Captain Marvel in 1972 and brought him back. Meanwhile, in 1939, Timely Comics published their first comic, which was called Marvel Comics, a name that was adopted by the company in 1961. So, the DC-Marvel rivalry was originally the Nap-Timely rivalry, and it goes right back to the beginning of superhero comics. It opened the floodgates for a wave of new superheroes. In a creative spurt that lasted just 4 years, from 1938 to 1941, most of the main characters of what became the DC universe were created, as well as some of the main characters of the Marvel universe. Marvel Comics number 1 featured Namor the Submariner. Namor is a classic aristocratic demigod. He is the son of a human sea captain and a princess of Atlantis, which is an undersea kingdom. Namor himself is a prince of Atlantis. His character is based on ancient legends of the Greek sea god Poseidon, as well as mermaids and mermen. He can breathe water, he has superhuman strength and speed, he can telepathically control sea creatures, and he can even fly thanks to tiny wings on his ankles. He's been called the first super anti-hero. This is partly because he is cranky and short-tempered, but mostly because he put the interests of Atlanteans ahead of those of humans. He would attack humans doing things that could harm Atlantis, such as polluting the oceans. However, when the US entered World War II, Namor helped them against the Nazis. Marvel Comics number 1 also featured a story with the Human Torch, who at first was not actually human. He was an android who accidentally burst into flames and then learned to control flame. This idea was based on ancient legends of fire demons who could magically control flame. He too fought the Nazis, and of course he was later reinvented as one of the Fantastic Four. Then in March 1941 came the last of Marvel's early Big Three superheroes, Captain America. He was a US soldier, Steve Rogers, who was given a serum that turned him into a super strong super soldier, a classic strongman who immediately fought the Nazis. The cover of Captain America number 1 showed Captain America punching Adolf Hitler and sold nearly 1 million copies. Like Superman and Batman, he was invented by 2 Jewish guys, a writer and an artist, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. In early 1941, the US still had not entered World War II, but Jewish people knew that the Nazis were committing atrocities in Europe against Jews and others. So Captain America was Simon and Kirby's way of saying that the US should enter the war. At first, the publishers got some protest letters and even threats, but those ended after the attack on Pearl Harbor. After that, Captain America became hugely popular as the first openly patriotic US superhero, and he was soon selling close to 1 million copies per month. In response to this challenge from Timely Comics, in 1940 alone, Nap introduced 8 new superheroes who were all grouped together at the end of the year into the Justice Society of America. I shall go through them briefly because most of them are just variations on superheroes we've already seen. They included the Atom, who had no superpowers, just great fighting skills; the Sandman, who had no superpowers, just a gas gun that put people to sleep; the Hourman, who was a scientist who invented a pill that gave him super strength and super speed for 1 hour; Dr. Fate, who was a magician; Hawkman, who had big wings and could fly and was modeled on the Egyptian god Horus; and the Flash, who had super speed and was modeled on the Greek god Hermes, even at first having his winged helmet. None of these were really new. Only 2 founding members of the JSA introduced new superpowers. The first of these was Green Lantern, who had a ring that could create anything he could imagine. This was also an updating of an ancient legend. Stories about magic rings that can grant wishes and cast spells have been made up all over the world and go back to ancient Greece and even earlier. So, the idea of the ring was not original, just the idea that such a ring could turn a person into a superhero. The Green Lantern's ring was at first presented as magic, then later reinterpreted as alien technology. So, Green Lantern started out as the subtype of wise man termed a magic man, then became a high-tech man. Finally, there was the Spectre. He was a police officer who was murdered but sent back from the afterlife, at first to take revenge on his killers, then to fight evil in general. Since he was undead, he could not be killed, and he could manipulate matter and energy and warp reality. The Spectre was not the first costumed Avenger. His origin story is a variation on Batman's. But he was the first to come back from the dead, and he was the model for Spawn and Ghost Rider later on. In 1941, Knapp introduced 3 more major superheroes. Aquaman, who's a straightforward imitation of Namor the Submariner, and so indirectly of Poseidon. Green Arrow, who is of course a modern Robin Hood with high-tech arrows, making him another high-tech man. And Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman quickly became Knapp's 3rd most popular superhero after Superman and Batman. Wonder Woman is another modern superhero explicitly based on ancient Greek gods and superheroes. She was the first true superpowered superheroine, although she did have predecessors, which we shall now look at briefly. In 1937 saw the first publication of Olga Mesmer, the girl with the X-ray eyes. She was the first science fiction strongwoman. Her mad scientist father had experimented on her and gave her super strength and X-ray vision. So she had X-ray vision before Superman, and she was the first superpowered female character. However, she was more a science fiction hero than a superhero. She did not have a code name, a secret identity, a costume, or a mission to fight crime. Instead, she found out her mother was from Venus, so she returned there. She was only published for about a year. But 1937 also saw the first publication in Britain of Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, who was a female version of Tarzan, the first jungle strongwoman. She was much more successful than Olga, leading to a string of US imitations. Rula, the jungle goddess, who debuted in 1937, Camilla, Wild Girl of the Congo in 1940, Phantoma, Mystery Woman of the Jungle, also in 1940, Nyoka, the Jungle Girl in 1941, and others. All of these were white women who ruled over black African tribes. This did not seem unusual to people at the time, since European empires like the British Empire still ruled over most of Africa. These characters were called jungle girls or jungle queens, although I would use the term jungle strongwoman. 1940 also saw the publication of The Red Tornado, who was a Superman spoof, the first funny strongwoman. She was a middle-aged housewife who fought criminals wearing red long johns, a cape, and a cooking pot over her head. Then in the 1950s, these two subtypes combined into the first funny jungle strongwoman, Cheryl the Jungle Girl. Meanwhile, the 1930s and 40s also saw the rise of several versions of the subtype of wise woman termed the Mystery Woman. Masked crime fighters like Domino Lady in 1936, the Woman in Red in 1940, Miss Fury in 1941, and the Phantom Lady, also in 1941. These were female versions of Batman, crime fighters without superpowers. None of these were true superpowered superheroines, and most of them did not last long. In August 1941, Canadian Comics introduced Canada's first superheroine, and indeed Canada's first superhero, Nelvana of the Northern Lights. Where Wonder Woman is based on Greek mythology, Nelvana was based on Inuit mythology. She was the daughter of a mortal woman and the spirit Koliak, king of the Northern Lights. This gave Nelvana the power to turn into a beam of light and travel on the Northern Lights. She could also turn invisible and shapeshift, which are common powers in Inuit mythology, and also melt metal and disrupt radios, which are not. She fought criminals, Nazis, and eventually aliens, mostly while wearing a fur-trimmed miniskirt. In short, she was mythological, superpowered, and sexy, just like Wonder Woman. However, she was not as successful. She ceased publication in 1947, although there have been recent efforts to restart her. In 1995, Canada Post issued a stamp depicting her as the first superhero with a genuinely Canadian identity. However, although she was based on Inuit mythology, she herself was white and was a part of the White Queen tradition. She was basically a northern version of Sheena, Queen of the Jungle. Then, in October 1941, Wonder Woman debuted. She completed NAP or DC's Big Three superheroes, together with Superman and Batman. I have spoken about Wonder Woman at some length in my talk on the feminist approach to superheroes, so I shall not repeat myself here. I shall just say that, like Captain America, she donned a patriotic costume, basically made out of the Stars and Stripes, and promptly went to war against the Nazis. Fighting against the Nazis boosted the popularity of comic book superheroes. It's been estimated that about 60% of US Army recruits read superhero comics. But after World War II ended in 1945, their popularity fell sharply. In the late 40s, Timely stopped publishing all of their superhero comics, and NAP stopped publishing all theirs, except the big three, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. In Canada, the war led to the creation of Johnny Canuck and Capt and Canada Jack, who were called superheroes even though they had no superpowers, just superior fighting abilities. They used those abilities to help defeat the Nazis, but after the war ended, they too soon ceased publication. The golden age of comics went downhill. Apart from the end of the war, there were two main reasons for the post-war decline in comics. The first was the coming of television in 1945. In the late 40s and 50s, TV took away much of the audience from all other media: radio, movies, books, newspapers, and comics. And secondly, comics got swept up in the growing concern over violence in the media, which led to an anti-comics campaign. In Canada, in 1949, a law was actually passed banning crime comics, which forced most Canadian comics to switch to romance and horror. Even so, 1954 saw police seize comics, comic book publishers convicted, and comic book burnings held in Vancouver and Quebec. This led to the temporary death of the Canadian comic book industry in 1956, only coming back in the early 70s. In the US, Frederick Wertham said that comics were lowering standards of literacy and turning young Americans into juvenile delinquents and homosexuals. And even though there was not a shred of scientific evidence for any of this, he was supported by some teachers, librarians, psychologists, and the Catholic Church, with the result that, as in Canada, some city councils banned comics and even held comic burnings. This difficult time has been called the Comics Dark Age and the Wertham Gap. In 1954, the US Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency said that if the comic industry did not begin to regulate its own content, then the government would. So, in 1954, comic publishers formed the Comics Code Authority, the CCA. Every comic had to have the CCA stamp of approval on its front cover, or it would quickly lose readers. The Comics Code was based on the Film Production Code, which similar public pressure had forced Hollywood to adopt in the 1930s. The code not only banned sex, drugs, horror, and graphic violence in comics, it also said criminals must always be portrayed as sordid and evil and must always lose in the end, and that police, judges, and other authority figures must always be presented in a respectful fashion. The code was big on respect for established authority, and in the early days, this was a very conservative form of authority. The code supported, quote, the value of the home and the sanctity of marriage, which in practice meant that female characters were to be overwhelmingly portrayed as obedient little housewives. This is why Marvel introduced no superheroines until The Invisible Girl in 1961, and also why, even though she was an adult from the start, her code name did not become The Invisible Woman until 1985. Similarly, in 1956, the CCA refused to approve one story because its main character was black. This is why there were no black superheroes until Marvel introduced the Black Panther in 1966, and why DC had no black superheroes until Black Lightning in 1977. The implementation of the code relaxed in the late 60s, and it was revised and liberalized in 1971 and again in 1989. After that, it gradually lost its authority and became irrelevant. Marvel dropped it in 2001 in favor of its own internal ratings system, and DC did the same in 2011, which effectively killed it. However, for about half a century, the CCA imposed its conservative moral code on US comics. Any criticism of US social institutions or those that ran them was strictly forbidden. The kind of social crusading and social criticism that Superman had initially undertaken was banned. And so, comics were integrated into the US's conservative ruling ideology. However, the code eased public concern over comics and gave them some legitimacy, so their popularity began to rise again. In 1955, Nap introduced their first new superhero in over a decade, J'onn J'onzz, the Martian Manhunter. He's a Green Martian based on the Green Martians John Carter befriended, except without the extra set of arms. He was a moderate success and recently appeared on the Supergirl TV series. In 1956, Quality Comics went out of business and Nap bought the rights to their characters, including Plastic Man. He debuted in 1941 at the tail end of the first superhero surge, when superhero parodies were popular, and he played for laughs. He could stretch his body into any shape, which provided many opportunities for visual gags. He has appeared in many different comics and recently on the Flash TV series. His superpower, which he gained by being doused in mysterious chemicals, is one of the most original superpowers introduced by modern superheroes. It is based on the stretchable properties of rubber and plastic, which of course did not exist in the ancient world. Like the Martian Manhunter, Plastic Man was a moderate hit, but not a huge hit. So then Nap had a better idea. They would introduce new, updated versions of their main 1940s superheroes, in particular the Flash, Green Lantern, Atom, and Hawkman. They gave them new costumes and new secret identities. In effect, a new person took on the role of the old superhero. They called the original superheroes Golden Age, and the new versions came to be called Silver Age. The Silver Age versions were more modern and have become much bigger hits than the Golden Age versions. The reboot began in 1956 with a new Flash, now without the helmet, and by 1961 most of the old heroes had been rebooted, and the Justice Society of America had become the Justice League of America, later just called the Justice League. The final act in the reboot was the introduction of the Teen Titans in 1964, bringing together all their teen superheroes into a sort of junior Justice League. The biggest change was made to the Atom, who in 1961 became a scientist who invented a suit that allowed him to shrink to the size of an atom. This idea was taken from the 1956 book and 1957 movie, The Incredible Shrinking Man. The explanation given for all the changes was that the Golden Age superheroes actually lived on a parallel Earth, Earth 2, and the Silver Age superheroes lived on Earth 1, this Earth. This allowed the old superheroes to do occasional guest spots with the new superheroes, which they still do. The Silver Age also saw the rise of the Marvel Universe. Timely Comics changed its name to Atlas Comics in 1951. As Atlas, they tried to revive their big three superheroes, Captain America, the Human Torch, and the Submariner, in 1953 to 54, but the effort failed. But in 1961, the comic world was changed forever by Stan the Man Lee. He had begun work at Timely Comics in 1939, and by the late 50s, he was Atlas's main writer and editor. Together with Jack Kirby, he was given the job of creating a new super team to compete with DC's newly formed Justice League. Lee and Kirby were another Jewish writer-artist pair. They began by creating a new version of the Human Torch, this time actually making him human, not android, and around him they built the Fantastic Four. But Stan wanted to do much more than just invent another supergroup. He wanted to redefine superheroes. He wanted the comic book industry to recognize that the time when comics were mostly read by kids was over. The comic book readers who were kids in the 1930s were adults by the 1950s, and many of them were still reading comics. But as adults, they wanted to read about adult characters. DC's superheroes were aimed at children, and so they were frankly childish. Perfect good guys like the big blue Boy Scout, Superman. They just went from catching one criminal to the next without a care in the world. They were very one-dimensional characters. Stan Lee said that just because you have superpowers doesn't mean that you don't still have normal human adult problems, like relationship problems. The Fantastic Four bickered among themselves and sometimes got depressed or bad-tempered. Spider-Man was a teenager who had teenage problems like self-doubt, uncertainty about the future, juggling dating and studying with his part-time job, and so on. In short, they acted like real people who happened to have acquired superpowers instead of perfect people who are heroic in every way. In 1961, Atlas signaled a change in direction by changing their name to Marvel Comics and issuing Fantastic Four #1. This was the beginning of another intense but brief creative surge. From 1961 to 66, Marvel debuted most of the main characters that came to form the Marvel Universe. First, in 1962, the Fantastic Four got their archenemy, Dr. Doom. He has been one of Marvel's biggest supervillains ever since. Victor Von Doom is an evil wise man. Indeed, he is one of the very few who is both a magic man and a high-tech man. He uses his genius both to invent super technology like his armor and to concoct magic spells. He is ruler of the fictional European kingdom of Latveria, and like any king, he wants to rule the world. I would argue that making him a supervillain portrays the aristocracy as bad guys, as contrasted with US capitalists, represented by Reed Richards and the Fantastic Four, who are the good guys. Part of capitalist ideology has always been that capitalists make a better, more deserving ruling class than the old, outdated aristocracy who just want to conquer and rule people. After Dr. Doom came a whole string of superheroes and supervillains. These included, in order of publication, the Hulk, Spider-Man, Thor, Ant-Man, the Wasp, Iron Man, Doctor Strange, the X-Men, Nick Fury, Daredevil, Hawkeye, Black Widow, Quicksilver, the Scarlet Witch, Kazar, the Black Panther, Galactus, and the Silver Surfer. In 1963, many of them were put together into the supergroup The Avengers, and in 1965, S.H.I.E.L.D. was created as an umbrella organization tying most of them together. In the same time period, Marvel also rebooted Captain America and the Submariner, as well as the Human Torch, and tied them into their new universe. Stan Lee also brought the Marvel universe closer to the real world than the DC universe. DC's superheroes all live in fictional places like Metropolis or Gotham City. Marvel's superheroes operate in real places, mostly New York and Los Angeles. Similarly, since the end of World War II, DC has made virtually no mention of real-life politics or real-world conflicts. Marvel, on the other hand, right away made communists the bad guys in many of their storylines. They figured they could boost sales by throwing their superheroes into the Cold War, just as the Golden Age superheroes had boosted sales by entering World War II. They established continuity through Captain America and Nick Fury, both of whom originally fought the Nazis, then fought the communists. But the lead in the fight against communism was taken by Iron Man, who was born when Tony Stark was captured by communists in Vietnam and had to create the Iron Man suit to free himself. In the 2008 movie, this was updated to being captured by terrorists in Afghanistan. But for his first 4 years, from 1963 to 66, over a third of his stories had him fighting communists. Since the 60s was a time of high political involvement, Marvel's new politically aware comics were an instant hit, especially with students. However, when the Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular, especially with students, in the early 70s, Marvel quickly reversed its storylines. Iron Man not only stopped fighting communists, he became so disillusioned with the Cold War that in 1975 he had Stark Industries stop manufacturing munitions and switch to developing peaceful, environmentally friendly technology. Meanwhile, back in the 50s, as Atlas Comics, Marvel had been forced to sign a distribution agreement with Nap, which became DC. When Nap saw Marvel as a threat to its own comics in the early 60s, they limited its distribution as much as they could, trying to squeeze it out. Stan Lee responded in a unique way by creating a personal relationship with his fan base. In 1964, he created a fan club called the Merry Marvel Marching Society. This was the beginning of organized fan culture, or fandom, which has since exploded into worldwide organizations and conventions which bring together many thousands of fans. Stan Lee has said that he formed the club because, quote, "I wanted our readers to feel they're part of a group, an inner circle, and we're all having a lot of fun that the rest of the world doesn't know about." In 1965, his comics introduced information pages called Bullpen Bulletins and a monthly column called Stan Lee's Soapbox. On top of that, he toured college campuses, did comic book signings, and generally made himself into a cultural icon, perpetuated more recently by his one-line cameos in the Marvel movies. He passed away in 2018, but in true superhero fashion, he came back from the dead later that year to do a posthumous animated cameo in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. And in 2019, he had posthumous live, so to speak, cameos in Captain Marvel, and his last cameo, fittingly, in Avengers Endgame. Arguably, the greatest superhero that Stan Lee ever invented was himself. By 1968, Marvel was selling over 50 million comics a year, and by 1972 it was outselling DC. Except for the occasional month, it has continued to do so ever since. 1972 also saw Stan Lee made publisher and president of Marvel. So, the DC and Marvel universes were essentially born in two brief bursts of creativity, from 1938 to 41 and 1961 to 66. Since then, the history of DC and Marvel has been a history of reboots. Essentially, each character is taken as far as the writers can go in a particular direction. Eventually, they run out of ideas and sales start to decline. So, they go back to the beginning, change the characters so that they're still recognizable but clearly new, and then develop them in a slightly different direction, and sales pick up. Once that direction reaches the end of the line, they do it all again. DC and Marvel have also copied each other's superheroes, with Marvel doing most of the copying. Marvel's first superhero was the Submariner. DC's Aquaman is a copy of him. But Marvel has copied many of DC's superheroes. The Flash became Quicksilver. Plastic Man became Mr. Fantastic. Hawkman became the Angel. The Atom became Ant-Man. And Green Arrow became Hawkeye. Also, Thor is Marvel's version of Wonder Woman, partly because they both have super strength, invulnerability, and flight, but more importantly, because they both provide a modern update of ancient myths and gods. And, oh yes, in 2014, Thor became a woman in the comics and will soon become one in the movies. DC actually introduced very little in the way of new types of superheroes or new superpowers. All of their superheroes were variations on the strong man or the wise man, and apart from super strength and super intelligence, nearly the only superpowers they used were invulnerability, flight, super speed, and magic. All of these were thought of back in ancient Greece, if not before. The only new powers were Superman's super senses, such as X-ray vision and heat vision. Marvel introduced a broader variety of superpowers and superheroes. However, they only introduced one new explanation for most of these powers: radiation. After World War II, nuclear energy was utilized both to build nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons. Radioactive materials were the cutting edge of science. Nobody knew exactly what they could do, but everyone knew they contained great power. So, the Fantastic Four gained their powers through cosmic rays. Spider-Man was bitten by a radioactive spider. The X-Men are mutations caused by radiation, and so on. There were exceptions. Thor and the Silver Surfer are aliens, and Doctor Strange uses magic. But for the most part, it was the power of radiation that turned ordinary humans into superheroes or into supervillains. Just as nuclear power could create a better world or destroy the whole world. In 1995, The Simpsons TV cartoon parodied this by introducing their own comic book superhero, Radioactive Man. Marvel still began with the strong man and the wise men. Strong men include the Thing, the Hulk, Thor, Captain America, and Spider-Man, all of whom have super strength. Kazar is a Tarzan imitation, and so is a jungle strongman. Nick Fury is first introduced as an ultra-tough commando sergeant, and the Black Panther has superior fighting skills. The Hulk and Spider-Man become wise men in their secret identities because they're both brilliant scientists. Mr. Fantastic, or Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, is a wise man, a prestigious scientist, but his superpower is an imitation of DC's Plastic Man. Doctor Strange is a magic man, and the Scarlet Witch is a magic woman, a witch. The Invisible Woman is also a modern magic woman, in that there are many ancient legends in which magic makes people invisible. Iron Man, Ant-Man, and Hawkeye are all high-tech men, with the Wasp and Black Widow as high-tech women. Apart from that, we have Quicksilver, who's another speedster, a modern Hermes. The Submariner is a modern Poseidon. Daredevil has radar sense to compensate for his blindness, which is new, since radar was only invented in World War II. But it is still a super sense, like Superman's. Jack Kirby has said that Galactus and the Silver Surfer were inspired by the Bible. Galactus has godlike powers, while the Silver Surfer is his herald, his flying herald angel. Both the DC and Marvel universes have grown to where today they each have over 2,000 super characters. Obviously, it's not possible for us to cover all or even a majority of these, but I am going to say a bit more now about the main Marvel superheroes. It all began with the Fantastic Four. They consist of Reed Richards, or Mr. Fantastic, the wise man, who as always is the leader of the group. Ben Grimm, or the Thing, who is of course the strong man. Sue Storm, or the Invisible Girl or Woman, who's a modern witch or magic woman. And Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, who's essentially a modern fire elemental. So they all have their roots in very old archetypes, but they've all been updated with modern science. They're not just a super group, they're a super family. Johnny and Sue Storm are siblings, and Sue eventually marries Reed. Ben Grimm, in effect, plays the role of cranky old uncle. It is the family dynamic, with a lot of bickering and teasing, but ultimately all loving each other, that humanized the Fantastic Four more than any previous superheroes. In particular, the Thing captured fans' emotions by introducing the figure of the tragic hero. Ben Grimm is a former US Air Force pilot, so his transformation into the monstrous Thing symbolized the returning soldier, disfigured by battle, the hero that everybody is grateful to, but that nobody wants to look at. Right after the Fantastic Four came the Hulk. The Hulk was based on the Thing, but went even further. The Hulk took the split between the hero's secret identity and his superhero identity to a new level. The wise man created the strong man. The scientist, Bruce Banner, became the Hulk, just as Dr. Frankenstein created his monster, or Dr. Jekyll became Mr. Hyde. On an emotional level, the Hulk is the personification of anger. Hulk smash! Banner only becomes the Hulk when he gets angry, and only stays the Hulk as long as he stays angry. The message here is that anybody can turn into a violent beast when they get angry. The Hulk's constant challenge is to control his anger and not let it control him. However, Banner was originally turned into the Hulk by the radiation from an experimental bomb he was working on. So, on a social level, the Hulk also symbolizes the terrible destructive power of the atomic bomb. The Hulk was invented during the Cold War, when the US and the USSR were pointing nuclear missiles at each other. The Hulk first appeared in May 1962, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was in October 1962. So the Hulk was originally Stan Lee's warning about the dangers of unleashing such power. Next came Thor. Thor is primarily a strong man, but with a touch of weather magic, since he can control the storm and lightning. His father, Odin, is the Norse wise man, and his brother Loki, the trickster, provides a built-in supervillain, an evil wise man. Stan Lee updated the Norse gods by declaring them to be aliens. Asgard is no longer a spirit world, it's just another planet in another solar system. This put Thor in the same category as Superman, an alien with superpowers. Thor allowed Marvel to integrate the old Norse gods and legends into the Marvel universe, just as Wonder Woman allowed DC to integrate the ancient Greek gods and legends into the DC universe. This was the ultimate reboot, turning religious figures that were once worshipped by millions into comic book characters. That it could be done shows that when the empires of Greece, Rome, and the Vikings collapsed, their religions collapsed with them. It's socially acceptable to turn their gods into entertainment because nobody believes in them anymore. Someday, people will probably do the same with Muhammad, but right now, trying to do so can still provoke a very violent reaction. Next came Spider-Man, who quickly became Marvel's most popular superhero. Spider-Man was a teenager, so teenagers could identify with him, especially since he suffered from teen angst. He was filled with self-doubt. He often got depressed. He worried about his grades and his girlfriends and looking after his Aunt May. He is the world's most ambivalent superhero. He was the first superhero who was not sure that he wanted to be a superhero because being Spider-Man interfered with his life as Peter Parker. He is certainly the only superhero who ever thought about quitting being a superhero because it was hurting his grades. There is a famous comic book cover, which was redone in a recent movie, showing his Spidey suit thrown in a garbage can. However, even though being Spider-Man can be a pain in the ass, Peter Parker always comes back to it. Why? Because otherwise there wouldn't be any more Spider-Man comics. But, in terms of his motivation, it all goes back to his origin story. When he first got his powers, after of course being bitten by a radioactive spider, he only wanted to use them to make money, not fight crime. So he just stood by when he could have caught a criminal, who then went on to kill his Uncle Ben. Since then, Peter Parker has been haunted by Uncle Ben's famous line, which was originally, "With great power, there must come great responsibility," later abbreviated to, "With great power comes great responsibility." Stan Lee has said that this was a deliberate paraphrase of a line from the Bible. "For unto whom much is given, of him shall be much required." Luke 12:48. Peter's guilt over Uncle Ben's death makes him take on the responsibility of catching criminals and rescuing people. And in the end, that responsibility overrides any personal inconveniences that being Spider-Man might cause him. Spider-Man's origin story is obviously a variation on Batman's. Bruce Wayne became Batman because his parents were killed by a criminal. Peter Parker became Spider-Man because his Uncle Ben was killed by a criminal. However, adopting a superhero persona has had very different results for these two. Bruce adopted the bat symbol because he deliberately wanted to be frightening, a creature of the night that could intimidate criminals. So as Batman, he is menacing and intense, a more extreme version of Bruce Wayne. But when Peter Parker becomes Spider-Man, it's like he becomes a whole new person. Peter Parker is a serious science student, always worrying that he's letting people down and getting on himself. Spider-Man is carefree, funny, and constantly wisecracking. Before Deadpool, Spider-Man was the only superhero who would make jokes as he fought supervillains. So, where Batman is obsessive-compulsive, Spider-Man is manic-depressive. Is this split personality really feasible? Yes, it is. Peter Parker feels the weight of responsibility every minute of every day. He can almost hear Uncle Ben's voice in the back of his head, telling him that he should be out there saving people and catching criminals. It's only when he puts on his Spidey suit and becomes Spider-Man that voice finally shuts up. The sheer relief of that makes him almost euphoric. For example, there is one comic where Peter is all depressed, then suddenly a monster appears and he has to become Spider-Man and fight it. And he asks, "Why am I suddenly in such a blasted good mood?" So he doesn't understand it himself, but the answer is that it's because the weight of responsibility is off him. He's using his powers to help people. He doesn't have to be depressed anymore. Depression is for Peter Parker. Spider-Man is the exact opposite. Carefree, literally laughing in the face of danger. He's never happier than when he's risking his life, because then he knows that he's doing all that he can do, that no one can ask any more of him. But this also means that being Spider-Man is like a drug. It's the greatest high in the world. Many people have said that you never feel so alive as when you're risking your life. The only problem is that when you come off the drug, you come down. Compared to being Spider-Man, being Peter Parker is boring and mundane. So he gets depressed all over again. And that makes him want to put on the suit and get high again, literally as he web slings high above the streets of New York. So it's actually a complex mix of emotions and motivations that keeps Peter coming back to Spider-Man. It is both a heavy responsibility and a source of great joy, a blessing and a curse. Spidey's semi-split personality also meant that he did not need a sidekick, because he was in effect his own sidekick, the serious Peter Parker and the wisecracking Spidey. Spidey's popularity meant that most superheroes stopped having sidekicks in the 60s, although some remain. For example, in the comics these days, Batman is working with his third Robin. The split between Peter Parker and Spidey also manifested itself in his girlfriends. For many years, he bounced back and forth between Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane Watson. For a while, they were the Archie, Betty, and Veronica of the superhero world. Gwen was the female Peter Parker, the daughter of a police chief, very serious and all about duty and responsibility. Mary Jane was the female Spider-Man, a fun-loving, carefree party animal. Peter fell in love with Gwen, but then she was killed during a battle with the Green Goblin, so eventually he married Mary Jane. But, judging by audience reaction, the death of Gwen Stacy was the single most traumatic event in the history of superhero comics. Much more traumatic than the death of Uncle Ben or Batman's parents, because they were introduced and then killed right away before you really got to know them. But readers got to know Gwen for years. She was Spidey's love interest. She was assumed to have main character protection, and then suddenly she was dead. No comic had ever killed off a long-standing main character like that before. It was a shock that some people have literally not gotten over to this day. There are Gwen Stacy websites that still rave over her, and comics analyst Ben Saunders has confessed that he is still, quote, haunted by her. I remember being emotionally affected by her death when I read it as a teenager in 1973, but not to that extent. However, this shows that Spider-Man brought a level of emotional involvement to his audience that no superhero had before. Gwen was brought back briefly as a clone, but this did not prove popular. However, she has also been transformed into Spider-Gwen. In an alternate universe, Gwen, not Peter Parker, was bitten by a radioactive spider and got spider powers. At first, she called herself Spider-Woman, then Ghost Spider, with the initials GS, Gwen Stacy, Ghost Spider. This new, superpowered Gwen has proven to be quite popular in comics and in the Spider-Verse animated movie. Finally, as regards Spider-Man, a few words about J. Jonah Jameson. Before Spidey, superheroes were publicly accepted as heroes. But JJJ was a newspaper editor who mounted an ongoing campaign to have Spider-Man branded a menace to society rather than a hero. This provided another thing for Peter Parker to get depressed about. All the other superheroes were loved and adored by the general public, but Spider-Man was at best viewed ambivalently and sometimes even hated by the public. JJJ kept up his campaign even after Spidey had saved his life and his beloved son's life several times over. Why did JJJ have this obsessive hatred of Spidey? Because JJJ was a caricature of Sterling North, the Chicago newspaper editor who first attacked comics in 1940. And JJJ's anti-Spidey campaign was a caricature of North and Wertham's anti-comics campaigns of the 40s and 50s. JJJ allowed Stan Lee to show how irrational and unfounded the whole anti-comics campaign had been from the start. Spidey keeps doing only good things, yet JJJ keeps calling him a menace, even though it makes no sense. JJJ allowed Stan Lee to fight back against the anti-comics campaigners, and they lost their influence in the 60s as American culture became more open and liberal. After Spidey, Marvel's next big hit was Iron Man, who debuted in March 1963. Iron Man is Marvel's most well-known high-tech man. Like the Hulk, Tony Stark is a wise man, an inventor, who uses his knowledge to turn himself into a strong man, Iron Man. Like Batman, he's a billionaire, so he essentially has unlimited money to spend on his super technology. Like Batman, he's a member of the rich upper class who spends his money and risks his life to save ordinary working class people. As such, they both serve the ideological purpose of presenting the capitalist class in a positive light. Not only that, but Iron Man links today's capitalist ruling class to the old ruling class, the aristocracy. Because Iron Man is, of course, a modern knight in armor. A knight's armor made him effectively superhuman in battle compared to those without armor. Iron Man is based on the medieval figure of the knight-errant, a knight who went around helping people and fighting bad guys and having adventures. But Iron Man is more than just a modern knight in armor. He, more than any other superhero, shows us that technology can give us superpowers. Tony Stark has no superpowers, but he invents a suit that gives him super strength and flight, two of the oldest superpowers, as well as more modern powers like energy blasts. The technology to make an Iron Man suit does not yet exist, but it may someday. Technology can give all of us superpowers. We may not yet be able to fly like Iron Man, but we can all fly just by getting on an airplane. 1964 saw the return of Captain America. He had supposedly been frozen in ice since the end of World War II, and so, as a man out of his time, he could provide a different perspective on the modern US. He was created, both in the real world and in his fictional world, as an American superhero super soldier to fight the Nazis. He was a patriot, he wore the US flag, he embodied the American dream. However, he grew up in the 1930s, and at that time, the American dream was Roosevelt's New Deal, which basically meant creating the welfare state and providing social programs to share the wealth. Also, on a personal level, Steve Rogers was a skinny little runt until he took the serum that made him into a big-muscled super soldier. So, he always identified with the little guy. This meant that for him, the US stands for values like freedom and equality and justice. While such values guided US government policy through the 60s, they faded in the 70s as right-wing politicians took over, largely dismantled the welfare state, and greatly increased inequality. As this happened, Captain America was not just a super patriot mindlessly cheering on the government. On the contrary, he repeatedly criticized US politicians for their failure to live up to US ideals. Similarly, because he slept through the Cold War of the late 40s and 50s, He thought the 60s government propaganda about Reds under the bed and the communist menace was all just paranoia, and he refused to support it. He was a soldier who opposed the US's military build-up and often argued with the generals. In short, Captain America, the ultimate US superhero, is what these days is considered a left-winger. He shows just how much US political culture has moved to the right since the 1930s. In 1966, Marvel made the transition to television with an animated series called The Marvel Superheroes, who were basically the Avengers. Other animated series followed with the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, and Iron Man, but by far the most popular was Spider-Man, which ran from 1967 to 1970 and which is still available in syndication. In 1967, Stan Lee invented a new Captain Marvel, Captain Mar-Vell, of the alien Kree army, who left the Kree to protect Earth. The 2019 movie rebooted him as a female Kree scientist. In 1968, US Air Force Captain Carol Danvers was introduced into the comic. In 1969, Danvers and Mar-Vell were both caught in an explosion, which killed him, but gave her his superpowers. She at first took the name Ms. Marvel, changing it to Captain Marvel in 2012. While Carol Danvers is the best known, several characters have actually taken the code names of both Captain Marvel and Ms. Marvel, including Billy Batson or Shazam as the original Captain Marvel, and Kamala Khan as the new Ms. Marvel from 2013. Just before Captain America's return came the X-Men, who I would argue are Marvel's most original superheroes. The plot device that the X-Men are mutants allows for a potentially endless supply of superheroes and supervillains with new mutant superpowers. Professor X is, of course, the team's leader. The other X-Men are his students. His title of professor immediately establishes that he is a wise man. He is clearly not a strong man since he's in a wheelchair, so he cannot fight physically, but he has enormous mental powers, including telepathy. As for the rest of the original team, the strong man was the Beast. The Angel had wings and could fly. Cyclops had a variation on Superman's heat vision. Jean Grey had telekinesis, which became widely used in science fiction stories and comics after World War II. Iceman was in effect the opposite of the Human Torch. He could become ice and could create ice. From their early beginnings, the X-Men displayed a social awareness by portraying mutants as a persecuted minority, and so drawing parallels with other persecuted minorities. Since superheroes are, by definition, different, they embody a plea for diversity and tolerance of minorities. In particular, Magneto, who is Professor X's archenemy and best friend, is Jewish. In 1981, it was revealed that as a child, he experienced the Holocaust. His parents were killed in a Nazi death camp. When he saw mutants also being persecuted, he formed his Brotherhood of Mutants to fight back, an alternative X-Men. Magneto's experiences led him to believe that it was us or them, that mutants had to take over humanity before humanity exterminated them. Professor X constantly argued with him, saying that humans and mutants could live together peacefully. Magneto at first appears to be a classic supervillain determined to take over the world. But then you realize that he's doing it to save his people. In 2011, IGN Entertainment Company rated Magneto as the greatest comic book villain of all time. The X-Men first appeared at the same time as the US civil rights movement of the 60s, which has also led to comparisons between the mutant struggle and that of African Americans, with Professor X playing the peacemaker role adopted by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Magneto as the more militant Malcolm X. So to be clear, Professor X is not Malcolm X. Both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were assassinated, and violence continues to mar relations between blacks and whites in the US. But for the most part, they still manage to live together. The Bronze Age of the 70s and 80s was characterized above all by the introduction of a wave of anti-heroes. Anti-heroes are heroes who kill, but are not villains because they do so in a good cause, such as saving others' lives. They are more adult heroes than traditional comic book superheroes, and their appearance reflected the demographic reality that many of those who had begun reading superhero comics as children continued to do so as adults, so that the superhero audience had grown up and wanted more adult themes and characters. Superheroes who kill take us back to ancient military superheroes, whose prowess was primarily measured by how many enemy soldiers they killed, and early portrayals of superheroes like Superman and Batman. Bronze Age anti-heroes began with Marvel's introduction of Ghost Rider in 1972 and the Punisher in 1974. Ghost Rider has superpowers because he's made a deal with the devil. And the Punisher has no superpowers but is an ex-Marine. Both of them have no problem with torturing and killing people to attain their goals. The Punisher has a similar origin story to Batman. His wife and children were killed by the mob, so he wages war on all criminals. But the Punisher is even more angry and driven than Batman, so he is much more violent and deadly. He first appeared just a few months before the release of the original Death Wish movie, which featured Charles Bronson as a similar vigilante. He was originally intended to be just a secondary character, but he became very popular in the late 70s and 80s, which was the heyday of anti-heroes. In 1975, the X-Men went through a major reboot, which included the introduction of a new anti-hero, Wolverine. This reboot expanded on the parallel between mutants and ethnic minorities by turning the X-Men into the United Nations of supergroups, which greatly increased their popularity. In the late 70s, the X-Men became Marvel's top-selling comic. Where the original X-Men were all white Americans, the 1975 X-Men were led by Storm, who was from Kenya, and was the first black and the first woman to lead a supergroup, and also included an Apache Indian, and members from Ireland, Germany, Russia, Japan, and Canada. The Canadian X-Man is Wolverine. Wolverine first appeared in 1974 as an agent of the Canadian government, joined the X-Men in 1975, quickly became the most popular X-Man, and got his own comic in 1988, which is still going. Similarly, he's featured in both X-Men movies and solo movies. His basic superpower is super healing. He can heal from any wound. This also gives him longevity. He was born in Alberta in the 1880s, so he's over 130 years old. In the 1960s, he joined Team X, a CIA Black Ops super team. This team was then experimented on by Canada's Department K. Wolverine, or Logan, had adamantium fused to his skeleton, which essentially makes him indestructible. His retractable bone claws became adamantium claws, which can cut through anything and make him a killing machine. He's been a professional soldier and a professional assassin, so killing people does not bother him. If the Thing symbolizes the disfigured soldier, Wolverine symbolizes the betrayed soldier. He's a superhero version of Rambo. The government made him a killer, then cast him aside. So, like the Hulk, he's an angry superhero, an anti-hero rather than a traditional hero. Following on the success of Wolverine, in 1979, the X-Men introduced Alpha Flight, who were basically the Canadian X-Men. They worked for the Canadian government's Department H, which was like the Department K that made Wolverine. Department H did not experiment on its members like Department K, but it still used and manipulated Alpha Flight according to its hidden political agenda. The team originally had 6 members, eventually expanded to 10. They had various superpowers, but they all had something distinctly Canadian about them, such as being indigenous or francophone. And they had Canadian-sounding names like Aurora, North Star, Shaman, and Snowbird. North Star was the world's first openly gay superhero. Alpha Flight got their own comic in 1983, which ran until 1994, making it the longest-running Canadian superhero comic of all time. Since then, there have been several attempts to revive them, but none have lasted long. However, there is talk of introducing them in future X-Men movies. At about the same time that Marvel introduced Wolverine and Alpha Flight, Canadian Comics debuted 3 very patriotic Canadian superheroes. Captain Canuck in 1975, Captain Canada in 1979, and Northgard in 1984. All 3 wore red and white costumes based on the Canadian flag. Also, Captain Canuck had a francophone sidekick named Quebec. Captain Canada had a francophone sidekick named Mamselle. And Northgard had a francophone sidekick named Fleur de Lis. Captain Canuck only lasted until 1981, but a recent web series has revived his popularity, and a new comic series began in 2015. He got super strength and super speed from contact with aliens, and he patrols a future in which Canada has become, quote, the most powerful country in the world, a superpower. Captain Canada has a suit of armor like Iron Man's, but that gives him even more powers, including super strength, flight, lasers, a force field, invisibility, becoming immaterial, telepathy, and of course has a built-in computer. He got the suit from Captain Newfoundland, who is an alien with almost godlike powers living in Newfoundland because it is the last surviving tip of Atlantis. Both captains were created in Newfoundland by Jeff Sterling, the owner of Newfoundland Television, NTV, and Captain Canada is still used as a mascot in NTV promos. Finally, Northgard had a super weapon called the Uniband, which gave him super strength, energy blasts, and other powers. He ceased publication in 1990, but was also revived in 2015. What these superheroes show is that there was a strong feeling of nationalism in Canadian fandom in the 70s and 80s, which has faded since then. In 1984, DC introduced Constantine, primarily created by Alan Moore, generally considered to be the best writer in comics at the time. Constantine is a magic man, a sorcerer detective similar to Siegel and Schuster's Dr. Occult, but not as powerful. He is a sarcastic, chain-smoking, adrenaline junkie, bisexual, who's based in London, England, and who was visually based on Sting, meaning skinny and blonde. The 2005 movie had him played by Keanu Reeves and moved to Los Angeles, which may be why the movie did not do so well. The Welsh actor Matt Ryan has done a much better job of portraying him on his own 2014 TV series and on DC's Legends of Tomorrow. Then in 1989, DC introduced the ultimate anti-hero, Lucifer Morningstar, reimagining the devil, not as a bad guy, but rather as God's prison warden. God put him in charge of hell, which is where the bad guys go after they die. However, he eventually got sick of this job and went on holiday to Los Angeles, where he opened his own nightclub, Lux. In the TV series Lucifer, which debuted in 2016, he became an assistant to the police, the traditional modern superhero's role. The popularity of anti-heroes continued into the 90s. In 1991, Marvel introduced another Canadian anti-hero, one supposedly born right here in Regina, the city that rhymes with fun. Deadpool. Deadpool is a different kind of funny strongman. He was originally conceived as a combination of Wolverine and Spider-Man. Mercenary Wade Wilson was dying of cancer, so Department K injected him with a serum made from Wolverine's blood. This not only cured his cancer, it gave him super healing even stronger than Wolverine's, but also made him crazy and uncontrollable. Like Wolverine, he promptly left Department K. But where Wolverine is grumpy, Deadpool is funny. Like Spider-Man, he provides a constant stream of wisecracks as he fights the bad guys. His costume is similar to Spidey's, and they have done team-ups. He's sarcastic and ironic, and is called the Merc with a Mouth. Merc meaning mercenary killer. He was first introduced as a supervillain, and even though he's become a superhero, he still enjoys hurting and killing bad guys. Deadpool has become extremely popular. The two Deadpool movies are currently the top two highest grossing R-rated movies of all time, with combined earnings of over $1.5 billion. This is partly due to Deadpool's whimsical portrayal by that great Canadian actor, Ryan Reynolds, who, as one film critic put it, quote, delivers every line with a smirk you can hear. When the first Deadpool movie came out in 2016, a petition was circulated to have a statue of Deadpool erected here in his hometown. Mayor Fougere said the government would not put money into it, but if private citizens wanted to raise the money and build one, they could go ahead. So far, it has not happened. Deadpool's popularity prompted the return of a DC anti-hero, Lobo. Lobo looks like Alice Cooper on steroids. Chalk-white skin, long black hair, heavy black eye makeup, an evil grin, and huge muscles. Lobo originally appeared as a supervillain in 1983, but then fell out of use until he was rebooted in the early 90s as an anti-hero. He was originally intended to be a parody of Marvel's anti-heroes like Wolverine, Punisher, and Deadpool, but became so popular that he became an anti-hero himself. He is most closely a parody of Deadpool. Like Deadpool, he is essentially unkillable. He works as a mercenary killer and bounty hunter. He's a homicidal maniac, but he has his own code. He has a sarcastic manner, and where Deadpool calls himself the Merc with a Mouth, Lobo calls himself the Main Man. Lobo was reportedly Stan Lee's favorite DC character, and he made his brief live-action debut in a 2019 episode of the DC TV series Krypton. The early 90s also saw the debuts of two more superheroes from hell, Spawn in 1992 and Hellboy in 1993. Spawn was a CIA operative who was killed by his partner for questioning the morality of the CIA's actions, such as killing innocent people. In hell, he exchanged his soul for the right to come back, got his revenge, and then continued to send more bad guys to hell. Again, he has no problem with killing. He's a more badass version of the Spectre, first published by Nap or DC in 1940. Hellboy is an actual demon from hell, summoned to Earth by the Nazis, but rescued by the Allies and raised in the US. Although he looks like a demon, he does not normally kill. Instead, he wisecracks his way through his fights, like Deadpool, although not as funny. Spawn was created by Todd McFarlane, who was a Canadian who was born in Calgary and moved to the US to become a writer and artist at Marvel. In 1992, he led a group of 8 writers and artists who left Marvel to form their own company, Image Comics. They put out a number of comics, but Spawn was the most successful until 2003, when they started to publish The Walking Dead. Hellboy was created by Mike Mignola, who tried to sell him to DC, but they wouldn't publish a hero from hell, so he joined a small independent publishing company, Dark Horse Comics, for whom Hellboy has been very successful. Spawn was made into a movie in 1997 and is due to be rebooted, and Hellboy was made into movies in 2004 and 2008. The fourth and last age we shall examine, the modern age of superheroes, which began in the mid-80s, has overlapped with the age of anti-heroes. However, its principal characteristic is the use of reboots. It has become standard policy at both DC and Marvel that whenever sales drop significantly, they go back to the beginning and put out slightly different versions of their main characters. This tactic has managed to revive flagging sales several times now. Major reboots at both DC and Marvel can be readily identified. DC did a major reboot from 1986 to 93, centered on the Crisis on Infinite Earths storyline. They changed their main characters, and in 1992, they even killed Superman, temporarily replacing him with 4 different Supermen. However, the original Superman came back in 1993. His death apparently made fans realize how much they missed him, and his return triggered a major increase in sales. In 2011, DC did another reboot, cancelling all their titles and reissuing them as the New 52. Again, they went back to the beginning and started over with slightly different characters. In 2016, DC wrapped up the New 52 storylines and did another reboot called DC Rebirth or DC Universe Rebirth. In 2018, Rebirth was dropped and it was just called DC Universe. In 2021, another reboot took place under the title Infinite Frontier, and yet another in 2023 entitled Dawn of DC. Although DC has introduced many new superheroes, its biggest sales have been gained by recycling those superheroes invented from 1938 to 1941. Like DC, Marvel also rebooted its Golden Age superheroes in the Silver Age. After that, the next major overall reboot took place in the 1990s in 2 parts. In 1996, Marvel cancelled all of its major titles and reissued them beginning at number 1 under the title Heroes Reborn. Then, in 1997, they did it again under the title Heroes Return. This allowed them to have 2 sets of first and last issues which boosted sales and increased their value as collectibles. Most recently, in 2015, they introduced another major reboot called the All-New, All-Different Marvel. In addition, Marvel has introduced artistic reboots. The Golden Age comics had a very simple artistic style, just framing the action. The Silver Age artists, led by Jack Kirby, introduced a more dramatic style with close-ups and odd angles modelled on camera angles in movies and television. After that, new generations of artists introduced new artistic styles, once in the 80s and again in the 2000s. Today's artwork is much more sophisticated and frankly better than it was in the early days of comics. In 2001 brought 9/11 and the War on Terror to the US. Both Marvel and DC issued special editions, the proceeds of which went to the victims of the attacks. Marvel, as usual, addressed real-life events more than DC. Spider-Man was shown swinging over the smoldering World Trade Center, and Captain America started fighting Arab terrorists. However, the War on Terror was always presented as much more morally ambiguous than World War II or even the Vietnam War, and was soon phased out by Marvel. In the 21st century, the main focus for both Marvel and DC has been the transition from comics to movies and TV, which make much more money because they have a much bigger audience. In 2013, Marvel and DC sold about 7 million comics a month to an estimated audience of about 2 million North American comics fans. But in that year, an estimated 60 million people in North America went to see Marvel and DC movies. Marvel movies began with Blade in 1998 and the X-Men in the year 2000. This was the start of a string of blockbusters which culminated in Avengers Endgame in 2019, which smashed box office records in earning over $2.8 billion. However, Marvel's transition to the movies was a complex affair. Due to declining comics sales in the early 90s, Marvel had to declare bankruptcy in 1996. In order to get out of this bankruptcy, Marvel had to sell the movie rights to some of their characters fairly cheaply to movie companies. For example, Sony bought Spider-Man, Universal got the Hulk, and 20th Century Fox got the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, and Daredevil. Their movies featuring these characters were successful, but Marvel got very little of the money. So, in 2004, Marvel launched its own movie studio, Marvel Studios, to create the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or MCU. Its first release was Iron Man in 2008. From that movie to the 22nd MCU movie Avengers Endgame, released in 2019, Marvel movies went through a single interconnected story arc with a single generation of actors. The creation of so many interconnected movies is unprecedented in the history of motion pictures. But it follows the standard comic format, where each comic book has a standalone adventure, but there's also a long-term story arc which links them together, especially through crossovers and super teams like the Avengers. The MCU's long-term story arc has been overseen by Kevin Feige, who is president of Marvel Studios and, in effect, the 21st century's Stan Lee. By 2019, Marvel Studios movies had generated total worldwide gross box office sales of over $22 billion, making them the highest grossing US movie franchise. The success of the Marvel movies made Marvel more valuable and so more attractive to the bigger entertainment corporations. In 2009, Disney bought Marvel, and in 2018, AT&T bought Disney's parent company, Warner Brothers. So, the Marvel-DC rivalry has now become part of the larger corporate Disney-AT&T rivalry. Being bought by Disney gave Marvel virtually unlimited funds to make the later expensive, high-tech, multi-star movies like the Avengers series. And in 2019, Disney bought 20th Century Fox, essentially giving Marvel back the rights to the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, who will probably be integrated into the MCU over the coming years. I would argue that the main reason for the enormous increase in the popularity of superhero movies is the invention of CGI, computer-generated imagery, or computer graphics. 20th century superhero movies, quite frankly, all looked silly. Special effects people did their best with trick photography and little models, but in the end they just could not portray superpowers convincingly. As a result, superhero movies like Christopher Reeve's Superman movies in the 80s and Tim Burton's and Joel Schumacher's Batman movies in the 90s all ended up being camp. Their makers could not take superheroes seriously, so they made fun of them and encouraged unrealistic, over-the-top acting to go with the unrealistic special effects. This approach found an audience, but it was not what superheroes are about. Most superheroes were not created to be figures of fun. They were created as serious, dramatic characters. The invention of CGI in the late 20th century allowed superpowers to be portrayed convincingly for the first time, and so allowed superheroes to be taken seriously for the first time. The first Marvel movie featured Blade, who has no superpowers, he just chops a lot of people's heads off. But the second movie, The X-Men, released right at the turn of the millennium in the year 2000, was a game changer. That movie portrayed superpowers and superheroes properly on the screen for the first time ever, and ushered in the current explosion of superhero movies. As a result, 20th century superheroes were primarily about comics, but 21st century superheroes are primarily about the movies and TV. The transition of superheroes into major motion pictures has created an interesting situation. Superheroes are now being portrayed in the movies not by unknowns, but by actors and actresses who are in the real world rich, famous celebrities. And we have elevated celebrity culture to the point where celebrities are virtually today's superheroes. First of all, superheroes are meant to embody physical perfection. So, whether in comics or movies, they're very good-looking and in great physical shape. Entertainment celebrities are, of course, the pretty people, the best-looking people in the world. In short, today's celebrities look like superheroes. They set the cultural standards that define beauty and physical perfection in our society. And secondly, like superheroes, celebrities can be very influential on society. The modern world is literally obsessed with celebrities. A 2008 study by Bill Tanser found that celebrity websites were by far the most commonly hit websites on the internet, attracting more hits than all sites on politics, religion, health, and diet combined. This popularity gives celebrities the potential to be social leaders. For example, the recent campaign against sexual harassment, #MeToo, began in Hollywood and has spread to the broader society. More directly, celebrities like Ronald Reagan, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Donald Trump have used their celebrity status to attain political power, which brings us full circle, because, as we saw in my earlier talks, that's what ancient superheroes did. Marvel's superheroes have made the transition to movies much more successfully than DC's superheroes. Marvel movies generally make a lot more money than DC movies, except for Wonder Woman, who's been a huge success. However, DC's superheroes have been more successful in making the transition to TV. Marvel tried making live-action TV series in the 70s, but the only one that gained any popularity was The Incredible Hulk, which ran from 1977 to 1982. After that, Marvel did not return to live-action TV until Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. debuted in 2013. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. became popular and ran until 2020. Inspired by this, Netflix debuted Marvel's Daredevil in 2015, Luke Cage in 2016, and Iron Fist in 2017, but they were not too popular and were all cancelled in 2018. Similarly, Marvel's Inhumans debuted in 2017 and was cancelled after just one season. Meanwhile, DC's Smallville ran for 10 seasons from 2001 to 2011 on primetime TV. Gotham ran from 2014 to 2019, and Arrow, starring Canadian actor Stephen Amell as the Green Arrow and filmed mostly in Vancouver, ran from 2012 to 2020. DC also currently has, or has recently had, The Flash, Supergirl, Stargirl, Batwoman, Black Lightning, Doom Patrol, Krypton, Legends of Tomorrow, Pennyworth, Superman and Lois, and Gotham Knights. Almost all of these have had much longer runs than Marvel TV series. Basically, Marvel series tend to run for just 1 or 2 years, while DC series run from 5 to 10 years. One of the reasons for DC's success, I would argue, is that they've found a way to combine the strong hero and the wise hero. The actual superhero is the strong hero, but these days, everybody has tech support. The superhero is in constant radio communication with a non-superpowered but really smart computer whiz back at home base, who's the wise hero, who provides any information that the superhero needs and who often figures out what the superhero has to do. Arrow, Flash, Supergirl, Batwoman, and Black Lightning all have this plot device. Marvel made fun of this in Spider-Man Homecoming by calling him, quote, the guy in the chair. But that expression has caught on in the superhero subculture. Being a superhero requires superpowers, but any nerd could potentially be the guy in the chair. Brains and brawn, the strong hero and the wise hero, together make a time-honored winning combination, and apparently also make for a winning plot formula. The final North American superheroes I'm going to look at are the most recent ones to attain major popularity. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. They debuted in comics in 2008 and became very popular when they were made into movies released in 2014, 2017, and 2023. Since most of their adventures take place in outer space, they are science fiction superheroes. All of the original Guardians are variations on the strong hero, except for one wise hero. Every supergroup has to have both. Drax the Destroyer is a classic strongman. He has super strength, superhumanly bulging muscles, and is a great fighter, but is none too bright. Star-Lord, or Peter Quill, is a different kind of strongman. He is the only Guardian who looks human. He does not normally exhibit super strength or any other superpowers, and by comparison with the other Guardians, he is an everyman figure that the audience is encouraged to identify with. He's also the only Guardian who has a superhero codename. This self-chosen codename, Star-Lord, is incredibly grandiose, and it appears at first to be just a product of his inflated ego, but turns out to be quite accurate. This is because he is only half human. While his mother was human, his father was an alien with godlike powers named Ego. This makes him the science fiction version of ancient superheroes who were usually described as the sons of gods. Although he only uses it in extreme circumstances, he is a being of immense potential power. Gamora and her adopted sister Nebula are strong women. Trained in combat from childhood and endowed with super strength, they are warrior women, futuristic Amazons. They're sometimes described as living weapons, and Gamora is called, quote, the deadliest woman in the galaxy, although Nebula is shown to be even deadlier. Groot, which is a contraction of Great Root, is neither strong man nor strong woman, since he's a tree. However, he is voiced by Vin Diesel, arguably the most macho male action hero in current movies, so he is in practice a strong man. He's also an updated version of ancient legends of walking trees. However, these were normally presented as menacing figures. Groot is the first tree superhero. Groot does not just have super strength, he has a variety of superpowers, such as the ability to grow his limbs with super speed. However, the power he most commonly exhibits is his super strength, using it, for example, to throw around whole groups of opponents as though they were dolls. He's been described as Rocket's muscle, which sounds obscene now I think about it, but goes back to when he first teamed up with Rocket, long before they met the other Guardians, in a classic strongman-wise man pairing. Rocket made the plans, and Groot made them happen. This brings us to the group's wise hero, Rocket Raccoon. His intelligence has been artificially enhanced through genetic and surgical manipulation, and he is clearly the smartest one of the group, while also being the smallest and physically weakest, a wise man, not a strong man, although in a fight what he lacks in strength he makes up in ferocity. Apart from his super sarcasm, he shows his intelligence both by formulating the plans which the Guardians follow, thereby playing the wise man's traditional leadership role, and by his ability to construct weapons from any available materials. While superintelligence is often paired with super morality, as in the case of Superman, this is not so with Rocket. Rocket is an anti-hero, a hero who kills. While all of the Guardians kill when they have to, Rocket enjoys it. He doesn't need a reason to kill, just an excuse. The other Guardians sometimes rein in Rocket's homicidal impulses, which makes them look more like good guys. As a super raccoon, Rocket is also a super thief and super mischievous. He's based on many ancient legends of talking animals, and in particular is an updated version of Azaban, a raccoon trickster spirit in North American indigenous mythology. Or, more famously, he's a raccoon version of Loki, the Norse god of mischief, who's also been incorporated into the Marvel Universe. Rocket enjoys spreading chaos just for the fun of it. More precisely, he flaunts his superior intelligence by creating situations where everyone is running around in confusion and only he knows what's really going on. His only redeeming moral feature is his loyalty to Groot. What else do I have to say about the Guardians of the Galaxy? Just one thing, and that is, of course, I am Groot. I think that says it all. That concludes what I have to say on North American superheroes. A transcript of this talk is attached if you're interested. Good day.